excited too. I'm so happy to be here with you guys for over a year now because I'm actually on maternity leave and I have a 10-month-old son now. As some of you may know, if you follow me on social media, is Alexandre Kingston Fortier. And while this presentation is brought to you by the Concordia Journalism Department, I should also say, in part, it's brought to you by my husband, Eric, because none of this would have been possible if he had been helping me with Alex to make sure that I had the time and space to get this done. So I'm very grateful to him. And he's actually out with Alex right now, which is why it is so remarkably quiet in my home, which is almost never the case. So maybe I should do these workshops more often because I just have a place to myself and some silence. Speaking of silence, it's probably a good opportunity to remind you guys to please mute your microphones for now during the presentation. Of course, I welcome questions, comments, but we'll save those for the end. And in the meantime, we'll just go through the presentation. The only exception would be if, there are lags, because of course, we're working with technology. I have clips to play. If ever something is delayed or there's a pause, we have a little bit of time to kill, that may be an opportunity to jump in with a quick question in the chat, and we'll see how it goes. I hope this works out well. I have been on Zoom, of course, having meetings and meetups with family and friends during the course of the pandemic. But it's actually my first time leading a workshop on Zoom with PowerPoint and everything. So to be honest, I've been a little bit nervous about it, and I hope it goes well. And, of course, also one of the advantages of doing it this way, virtually, is the reach. Typically I would be at Concordia in a classroom just speaking to students or professors, and the audience would be limited. But now people can join us from anywhere. So I know it's not just journalism students or professors, it's anyone who's interested in the topic. And it's not just people in Montreal, it's people in other cities, even other provinces, I believe. So welcome, thank you. I was really blown away by the response to this. And as a matter of fact, my mom told me, because I sent her the link, said, "Mom, you should register for this." And she said, "I tried, but it was sold out. So sorry, Mom." But as Robin said, this is being recorded. And so the link will be available. If you know anyone who's interested in this and wasn't able to sign up, there will be a link available for everyone to be able to see the presentation after, at their leisure, whenever they want. I want you to see this as me inviting you over to my place, which is really essentially what's happening. I'm here in my living room. I've got my cup of tea in my Concordia mug. I really just want it to be relatively casual, despite the weight of the subject matter. So that means, at the end, when there's time for questions and comments, I want you guys to feel comfortable jumping on, show yourselves on camera if you're comfortable with that. If you're not, I understand. You can also just leave comments in the chat box. But, it's not just about me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. And you'll notice that I'm including a lot of voices in this presentation. You're going to be hearing different audio clips from different people, because I think it's important to include a plurality of voices. And you will see that there's a common thread, and there are certain things that come up again and again. There are certain narratives that are consistent, or certain experiences that are consistent, whether you listen to journalists in the United States or whether you listen to journalists here in Canada. And, throughout the pandemic, I've been listening to podcasts on issues of racial diversity in journalism, and this reckoning on race that all industries, I would say, are experiencing right now. Of course, including journalism, obviously, it is not exempt. No one is immune. We have to hold a mirror up to ourselves and give it a hard look and say, what are some of the issues that we're dealing with in our newsrooms? So the podcasts, that I've been listening to, while washing the dishes, folding laundry, playing with Alex, whatever, A lot of them happen to be American podcasts, but I don't want you to think that that means that this is an American issue. This is very much a Canadian issue as well. And so we're going to hear Canadian voices, you know, if not in audio, I'll read you some quotes, some excerpts from articles. It's really something that needs to be addressed here as well. Because one of the things that, you know, I find is when we want to talk about racism, we often hear, well, that's an American problem. Like, that's happening in the States. It's not as bad in Canada, or it's not happening here. That is not the reality, as you'll see. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to go about starting this presentation, I thought, okay, where do I begin? How do I start this thing? And I thought that I should talk about the murder of George Floyd to start, because that is really the genesis of all this. This is where everything originates. And I want you to know that I am choosing that word with intention, okay? Because what happened was that this Black man was murdered, okay? To say death is passive in a sense. And I'm gonna get into this a little bit more later on in the presentation, the importance of language and the words that we choose. Now, obviously, as journalists, we have to be careful when a case is before the courts. So to be clear, we cannot say that this police officer murdered George Floyd because, you know, under the eyes of the law, you know, he is innocent until proven guilty. And that's where words like allegedly come in. This person allegedly did this. This person allegedly did that. But the fact is, there was a murder. That's an indisputable fact. So that is something to consider when you choose what words you're using to describe something in news coverage. Now, I have to say that I mourned for George Floyd in a way that I would mourn someone that I knew personally. And obviously I didn't know him personally. I grieved for him. I cried for him. I lost sleep over him. I confided in family members and friends and colleagues about how I was feeling about all of this. And it struck me that, you know, I was grieving for this man in a way that I hadn't grieved before when other Black men were killed at the hands of police officers. And their stories made the headlines, you know, and provoked protests and riots in the streets. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. We're familiar with the names, you know, Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, just to name a few. So this is not, you know, one-off thing. With George Floyd, I was really struggling to process my emotions about it. And for me personally, one of the reasons it hit differently this time is because now I am a mother. I am a mother and I have a son. So as a Black mother who has a little boy, you know, who's very young now, he's just 10 months old, but I'm already thinking of conversations that I'm gonna have to have with him when he's older. And you know, some of you may know I'm quite active on social media. I post a lot on my Instagram account, on Twitter, and Instagram is almost like a diary for me sometimes, well, a public one. And what, I mean, of course, I post, you know, things that aren't so serious, and you know, that can be fun too, like a day at the beach, but I also use it to talk about very serious issues. And this was a case where I thought, okay, I'm gonna share how I'm feeling about this. And so I posted this. I'll just read you an excerpt from this. Alex is 6 months today. A lot of people, regardless of race or whether they have children, are angry right now. As a Black mother, what resonates the most with me is the particular trauma this is causing for the mothers of Black sons. We are feeling so many emotions right now. I see it all spilling out on my social media feeds. We are outraged, we are sad, we are frustrated, we are tired. The weight of weariness feels oppressive. We are struggling to make sense of senselessness. We are scared and worried about the future of our babies, and we are fearful for our boys and our men because others are fearful of them. As we watch the news about George Floyd, we ask ourselves, why does this keep happening? Now the response was, the response, what the response told me in all the comments on this post was that it struck a chord and that it resonated with people. And so I felt the need to expand on it. And that's when I decided to write a personal essay. So I spent a few nights writing a longer piece, and I didn't question it too much at the time. I just wrote it. I just had to get it out of my system. And then I figured, okay, I'm going to grapple with, the fact that I'm talking about something so personal and it's in the news, and is that the right decision to be making, and will this even be published, or like what are the boundaries? Is this going to raise questions about my objectivity as a journalist on race issues? Those are all things that obviously I did have to think about. But in the moment, I had to get this out of my system. And for me, one of the best ways to process my emotions is to write about what I'm feeling and what I'm going through. And so I wrote a piece, and it was personal, but also professional, in the sense that I was addressing aspects of dealing with this as a mother, but also what this all meant for me as a professional, as a Black journalist. And I wrote the piece. I sent a note, I sent an email to my boss about it, and so that I felt, this was something that I felt very strongly about this, and I would like it to be published on our website, the CTV Montreal website. And he was very supportive, and within 24 hours, it was on our website. And the result, or the response again, was just overwhelming. It was people saying that these were things that they thought or experienced, but were afraid to say or didn't know how to say. And it was cathartic to see it being expressed by someone else. So I am, I'm humbled by that, and I feel that if that is the result, then I have accomplished something with this piece, and I have no regrets about writing it. Although I did worry about how it would be received and whether I'd be criticized for it. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from that piece, which is on the CTV Montreal website. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is me talking about it in a tweet and saying that, like so many others, I feel compelled to speak out. This time, something feels different, as if we've reached a tipping point. Many of us feel broken. I've never heard so many of the Black people in both my personal and professional circles saying they're not okay, that they simply cannot cope with the videos, images, and comments they absorb on social media, that they've been struggling to manage both simmering rage and profound sadness, that they have wept, that they are beyond exhausted, yet can't sleep at night. It's ironic, the crushing mental fatigue caused by all these high-intensity emotions is keeping us wide awake. The pain is raw and real. And then I go on to talk about reporting while Black, if you want to call it that. When race issues dominate the headlines and you are a person of color covering them, it is always exhausting and emotionally taxing, traumatic even. When it happens, I know I'm not alone. Black colleagues and friends from various media outlets reach out to one another. We vent extensively about how frustrated we are and how tired. We rally around each other, trying to keep morale up. And I talked about some of the experiences that we've dealt with as Black journalists, being questioned about our objectivity, dealing with microaggressions, overt prejudice and racism, unfair assumptions, stereotypes. One of the examples that I gave in the piece was a Black male reporter who was at a courthouse to cover a court case and was stopped by the constable who was standing on guard outside of the door to the courtroom and demanded to know where his lawyer was. And keep in mind, all the other white journalists entered the courtroom freely, no questions asked, but this one Black male reporter was singled out and questioned about where his lawyer was, because the assumption was that he was the one who was there to make a court appearance. And when I wrote about that in my piece, another Black reporter that I know, another Black male reporter, said, that happened to me too. And, you know, adding insult to injury is that he's walking around with a microphone, recording equipment, a pen, and a notepad. I mean, he would clearly look like a reporter. It would seem quite obvious that he's carrying the tools of a reporter covering a story. And yet he was still questioned about what he was doing there and where his lawyer was. And these are not isolated incidents, I think it's important to point out. Now, this piece was published and it led to, you know, an outpouring of support and a lot of requests to speak and to do interviews and participate in panels like this one. So that's how this came about, and that's why we're here today. And, you know, as I was preparing this, I opened up my PowerPoint and I realized that I had a PowerPoint on diversity from 2016, which, to be honest, I'd forgotten about because, you know, a lot has happened since 2016, and this had kind of escaped my memory. Oh yeah, like I did do that presentation at Concordia about diversity in Canadian media. So this is a screen grab of this presentation that I did in 2016, and at the time I was, you know, in an actual classroom. It wasn't virtual, so things have changed. But I started scrolling through this 2016 PowerPoint, and, you know, I thought to myself, I could literally copy paste these exact slides and put them into a new presentation, and it would be exactly the same thing, which is disheartening, to be frank, because time is passing, years are going by, and it feels sometimes that nothing's really changing. And what I like to call it is diversity deja vu. That's what I'm calling it now. I have been passionate about this issue for a long time, and I want to go back further than 2016. I want to go back to 2004, because at that time, you know, as Robin mentioned, I was a student at Concordia, and I wrote a paper called The Misrepresentation, the paper that I still have, because I keep these things. I'm a bit of a pack rat. The Misrepresentation of Minorities in Broadcast News. Brian Gabriel was my professor. Some of you may know him, and we're actually still in touch today. So this research paper was largely focused on a book by journalism professor and former reporter Don Hyder, who happens to be a white man. And he wrote a book called White News: Why Local News Programs Don't Cover People of Color. So yeah, an American journalism professor and former reporter. I'm going to read you a description of the book. This is from Amazon.ca. I thought this was one of the best descriptions of the book, so I'm just going to quote here from this description. Hyder examines the perceptions of racism and ethnicity and addresses such dichotomies as white news, content determined by white managers, being delivered by non-white news anchors, thus giving the appearance of non-white news. He also considers how coverage of minorities influences viewers' perceptions of their minority neighbors. Hyder then sets forth a new theoretical concept, incognizant racism, as a way of explaining how news workers consistently ignore news insignificant portions of the communities they cover. And his book starts with a reflection on his own newsroom experience. He writes, having spent many mornings and afternoons sitting in on editorial meetings where news coverage decisions are made, I knew journalists didn't generally sit around the table and say, how can we include, insert, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, or Native Americans today? Yet, if you watched our 5 p.m. show, it was as if that is exactly what we had done. And he continues by asking, so between 9 a.m. when most newsroom employees show up and 5 or 6 p.m. when the day's primary newscast airs, what goes wrong? And he argues that local news coverage portrays minorities in limited, stereotypical ways, primarily as criminals or as street revelers. Think cultural festivals, for example. So they're either identified with crime or cultural celebrations. And these coverage patterns reflect a lack of diversity and sensitivity in many newsrooms. So here's a quote from my paper. This is something that I wrote in describing this book. Insufficient coverage of minorities can be primarily attributed to the predominant concentration of decision-making power in the hands of white men. So this is 2004, it's 2020, diversity deja vu. We're still having the same conversations. These statistics are from the Radio and Television News Directors Association, the American one, I should point out, and the name has changed, by the way, but this is what it was called at the time. So Hyder wrote that in 1996, in decision-making positions, whites still make up the majority of news directors, and you can see the numbers for yourself on the screen. So news directors, 91%, assistant news directors, 90, executive producers, 93, managing editors, 85, assignment editors, 84, producers, 86. Now, you may look at that and say, well, you know, those are old statistics and those are American ones, and that's fair, you know, but the reality is the situation was and still is very similar in Canada. I can tell you that the American Society of News Editors collects data, but we are lacking more current data in Canada, and that is part of the problem. So I want you to listen now to an audio clip. This is from one of the many podcasts I listened to, and you're going to be hearing from Brian Daly, who is a lineup producer for CBC Nova Scotia. He's also the Atlantic director of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, and he has 25 years of experience working in the media. And I know Brian personally because he also used to work in the CTV Montreal newsroom, and he's a great, great guy. So let's listen to what Brian has to say about the lack of available data. So you guys can still see everything, Robin, we're good. Okay, and let's make sure that the audio is good too. Want to give me a thumbs up, Robin?
The Canadian media are not all required to gather and disseminate those statistics. Broadcasters, so radio stations, television stations, which are under the umbrella of the CRTC, are required to keep that sort of data of who works for them and what different groups of people work for them, the composition of their staff. There is no such law governing newspapers, which now essentially is an outdated term, digital publications. Anybody who starts up a website, anybody who operates in that space is not required to gather that sort of data. That makes it easier for systemic racism to continue because the way things work in our country and throughout the Western world is there's a very intense focus on statistics and data in order to prove many things. And so our community finds itself continually at a disadvantage because those who hold the power will always say to you, prove it. You've given me your story, Brian Daly, but prove to me that it's systemic in nature. How can you do that if you don't have the data to back it up? Now, I can give you certain statistics. The last two news organizations that I have worked for had all white management teams. If I were to go back, I'd say probably in my 25 years in the media, every single manager at every news organization that I've worked for has been exclusively Caucasian. There hasn't been an Asian, there hasn't been a Black person, there hasn't been an Arab person or an Indigenous person. So even that technically is anecdotal, because I could give you the list of names, could go cross-reference that list of names if you had time to against the internet. But I've been in this business since 1994. You probably wouldn't be able to do it. The only way to gather the data is for news organizations to keep demographic data on their staff so that we can then work towards increasing representation of Black people in newsrooms.
So sometimes I think it's just best to let other people speak, because Brian just articulated it so well. And he also articulates very well what racial inequality looks like in Canadian media. So I'm just going to backtrack here and play another clip from this podcast. And we'll hear Brian on that.
What it looks like is that when people in our community, in the Black community, watch television, listen to radio, consume media in this country, we don't find that our views and our voices are reflected in any way, shape, or form in a significant way. You will see from time to time certain personalities, typically on television, who would be of color. However, in key decision-making positions, which is something the public's not quite aware of, key decisions in media are made by people who you would never see. You'd have difficulty finding them, even in a Google search in some cases. They're quite anonymous, but very powerful. It's extraordinary how much the Caucasian community dominates behind the scene in the media. Just to give you an example, in certain media organizations, every single manager would be Caucasian. There are some news organizations in this country that do not have a single person of color on the leadership team. And it reflects itself in many ways. Most notably, the way that people would notice it would be the coverage of certain communities. You can sense in the tone of coverage, I've sensed it my entire life, the Black community are treated as though we are foreigners, that it's sort of almost covered like as if you would send a foreign correspondent to another country and try to dumb it down for the home audience. Communities of color in this very country are treated as though we are foreigners, and it's almost as if we are sending correspondents to interpret how these outsiders, these strange people act and walk and talk and how they think, and very much treated as strangers in a strange land when the truth couldn't be further from the truth. You look at communities in Quebec, many of them trace their roots back to the early 20th century. Not that it should matter. Anybody with a Canadian passport, it should be considered Canadian, but for some people, it makes a difference whether you were born in the country or not. Well, I can assure you that even in the big cities where there's this view that it's all a bunch of foreigners, there were many people of color throughout many communities, born in the country, as Canadian as anybody else, but still fighting to be recognized as fully part of this country.
So I think that that sums it up very well. Just another reminder, because I think I heard someone accidentally, maybe they unmuted. So just please remember to keep your microphones muted. And I just want to pick up on this idea of being covered as foreigners or treated as foreigners. I think Brian raised a really interesting topic there, because again, one of the examples that I used when I wrote this personal essay, this opinion piece that's on the CTV Montreal website, is a journalist colleague who was singled out. She felt humiliated by this. She was in tears over it. Felt singled out because someone on Twitter referred to her as a foreign journalist, and adding insult to injury is that this was supposed to be a compliment to her, because this person was trying to praise her interview style and how well she was doing her job, how professionally she was doing her job. And called her a foreign journalist. And this is someone who was born and raised here. And so that speaks to this othering of Black people that happens sometimes, which is hurtful and damaging. Now, I want to talk about numbers again. So I'm just going to maximize this PowerPoint here. You know, I told you that I could copy paste slides from my 2016 presentation and put them into this one. So that is exactly what I did. This was the opening slide, diversity in Canadian media. If you're only publishing a certain selection of people, you're not getting all the perspectives on any issue. Canada is not that homogeneous. This is from Kate Hartfield, former editorial pages editor of the Ottawa Citizen. So let's go into Canadian numbers, at least the most current ones at the time. Maybe you guys, I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to pop into the chat and answer this question. What percentage of journalists across all Canadian media are white? What would you guess? What do you think? I'm going to give you, maybe 30 seconds to just pop some answers into the chat. "95, 90, 85, 90, 90, too many, around 87, 90, 90, 95, 90, 90, 85 to 90. That's so interesting. Nobody is going below 85. So okay. So 85 to 90. Somebody says census 2016, 87. I think somebody's Googling. Okay. So this is the information that that I had at the time in 2016. 97. 97%. So a 2000 study by Laval University showed that the vast majority of journalists across all media were white. So Laval University, right here in Quebec City, 97% to be exact. Has there been a similar study since in the past 20 years? I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure. I'd have to do research. I would have to look into that. But I suspect that not all that much has changed. Let's dig a little deeper. 2004, visible minorities, 12.3% of anchors. And just to circle back to the point that was made in Don Hyder's book, you may sometimes have the appearance of diversity because you may have a face that is a person of color, but the invisible people, and Brian referred to this, the people behind the scenes that you don't see are the ones with the real decision-making power. They're at the top of the newsroom hierarchy, and they make up the vast majority of the decision-making players. 8.7% of reporters and interviewers in English language news are visible minorities, and this is from the Canadian Task Force for Cultural Diversity on Television. 2004, non-white newspaper reporters, 3.4%. This is from John Miller, former journalist and former director of newspaper journalism at Ryerson University. In 2010, so we're getting a little bit more current, minority groups, including Indigenous people at CBC Radio-Canada, 8% of reporting staff. Let's look at the Canadian population. 2011, visible minorities, 19.1% of the population. Toronto and Vancouver, visible minorities, more than 50% of the population. 2031, this is a Canada-wide projection for 2031. Visible minorities will make up 29 to 32% of the population. This is from Statistics Canada in 2008. Again, I just want to acknowledge here that, yes, these are older statistics, because these are slides that I'm pulling from a 2016 presentation, but the point of doing that is to show you that even now in 2020, I'm sure if we looked at the numbers, you know, and you heard Brian describe it, it would be similar. Just in terms of representations in newsrooms. A lot of it is anecdotal at this point, but you know, Brian explained, you know, never having worked for a manager who has been a person of color in 25 years in the business. I also want to talk about this term visible minorities. Because, you know, I told you earlier that I was going to be talking about language and the words that we choose. So this is the language that, you know, I was using in 2016. In the presentation, today's presentation, you'll notice that I chose the term racialized groups instead of visible minorities. Again, that was a deliberate choice. And it's because language evolves and we need to evolve as well. And I want to point out that in 2014, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, in talking about racial discrimination, sent out a press release saying that, you know, recognizing that race is a social construct, the commission describes people as, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I'm seeing a typo in this on the fly, not radicalized, racialized. Oh, it's an autocorrect. Sorry, guys. This is what the computer does. Racialized person or racialized group. Let's start over again, just so we're clear. So in 2014, the Ontario Human Rights Commission settled on a term to describe what, you know, we've often called visible minorities. And they wrote, recognizing that race is a social construct, the commission describes people as racialized person or racialized group instead of the more outdated and inaccurate terms racial minority, visible minority, person of color, or non-white. Now, this is something that was addressed in an NPR article, why we have so many terms for people of color. And it refers to a little controversy at the Toronto Star because of something that a reporter wrote. The article says that last week, the Toronto Star found itself in the midst of one of those blink and you missed it internet kerfuffles over race. Here's what happened. The Ontario Human Rights Commission had settled on a term to use in reference to people of color, racialized people. The commission wrote the quote that you just saw earlier. And in turn, Star reporter Natasha Grzinczyk, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, created a list, 5 other labels for people of color or non-whites, racialized people. It seemed to be riffing on a common idea that these designations are tortured and overly sensitive. Some readers complained that Grzinczyk was making light of the agency's decision, and the story was subsequently removed from the Star's website, and a few hours later with a note saying that it did not meet the paper's standards. Okay, so that's just, you know, some food for thought when we consider language and you know, using terms to describe people in a way that is respectful to them and in a way that acknowledges how they feel about what they're called. You know, if language didn't evolve, we would still be calling Black people Negroes, just to make the point. I want to talk about racism versus bias. And I think that, again, I'm going to go back to Brian, good old Brian, because he's so good at breaking things down. So let's listen to what Brian has to say about racism versus bias. I'm just going to cue this up here. And And I think I'm gonna refresh this page. Okay. That's better. Okay, here we go.
Want to define bias, I mean, it's your blind spot as a reporter, or your blind spot as a leader in the newsroom. You're unable to see things from the perspective of people who are different from you, who have a different color skin from yours, or who've come from another country. And that's reflected in coverage. And I talked earlier about how bias can be reflected in coverage, which is when news organizations treat their fellow citizens as though they're not fellow citizens, as though they're outsiders, as though they're from somewhere else, as though they're a novelty mascot, you know, not a person deserving of dignity. Bias can also be reflected in large part by what's not covered. There's a lot of talk about, you know, media stories being twisted and media stories reflecting bias. Personally, I think it's more common to have bias reflected through omission rather than commission. You know, seeing story after story from an ethnic community such as ours, which are focused on crime, or just not seeing us covered at all. That can be very damaging to simply not see your community reflected at all in storytelling. Another huge one for me throughout my career has been the categorization of Black people into certain areas where white people feel comfortable. Sports and entertainment. When you look at your news networks, if you see a Black face up there, this is just, I'm so programmed. When I look up, if I'm in the gym or if I'm in a newsroom where I'm looking, I can't hear the sound or whatever, I just see the face. Oh, he must be talking about the Raptors, or he must be talking about entertainment. And sure enough, most of the time they are. You wouldn't assume that a Black person would be talking about international trade. I remember it was a shocking day for me. It was 2 years ago in 2018. I looked up at a news channel and saw a Black man who looked a lot like me, a Black man. And I thought, wow, he's dressed really well to be talking about sports. That was actually my thought. And I turned up the volume. He was a lawyer talking about the Canada-US softwood lumber deal. Groundbreaking to me, groundbreaking. I've never seen that before. A Black man talking about international trade. Who would have thunk it, right? Even though how many Black lawyers are there in Canada? A lot, you know?
I wanted to get your thoughts.
That was one of those light bulb moments for me when I listened to that podcast. I mean, in the sense that I guess I just want to make the point that no one is immune. We all have biases. I mean, even Black people will stereotype or make assumptions about other Black people based on what we've been conditioned to think. I mean, Brian said it. He said, I'm so programmed. So he sees this Black guy, you know, in a suit on TV, doesn't have the volume on. He's just like not really paying attention. It's like, oh, wow, he's really well dressed for sports, you know, because he, even as a Black man himself, is assuming that this guy is only covering sports because that's what we've been conditioned to see, to expect. And so, you know, stereotypes are very powerful. They're a way to, they're a way for the majority to assert power and preserve the status quo. So I want to go back to the research paper that I was telling you about. That this goes back to 2004, and Don Hyder quoted other academics and scholars while writing his book, and he refers to research in a book called Television, Radio, News, and Minorities. So let's get back to the slide. And the authors write, majority culture domination often carries with it the power to stereotype. It is in itself a way to maintain power, in fact, because it underlines the ability of those holding power to portray those who do not. So let's just go back to what we heard Brian say in the podcast. In 2018, he was shocked to see a Black lawyer on TV analyzing international trade. So just, imagine watching TV and it being a groundbreaking moment to see someone who looks like you in a position of authority, or in a prominent position, or a position you wouldn't have expected. This is where we get into discussions about things like white privilege. It is white privilege to be able to turn on the TV, watch the news and see people who look like you and all the time, and completely take that for granted. I'll take it further. I think someone referred to this in the chat. It's not just news, it's everything. Like, has anyone noticed that lately in commercials, even, commercials about anything, like banks, I don't know, stores, brands, this, that, the other, cars, all of a sudden you're seeing all kinds of people, it's shocking to me. It really is. I turn on the TV now and I'm seeing way more diversity in terms of, who these ads are featuring than I've ever seen before. And it seems that this is a direct result of this reckoning on race in the results in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. I'm just going to go into the chat here. And companies have announced new hiring policies for equal representation and hiring diversity. Yeah. And TV shows, and yeah. So I'm looking at the chat, and so other people are seeing it too. So this speaks to the importance of representation, and that's a point that I want to make. If you take one thing away from this presentation, I want you to know that representation, if you take away one thing from this presentation, not sure if that's what I said, I want you to know that representation matters. So think about the voices and the faces you're choosing to include in your stories. Think about who you're calling when you're booking an expert guest. Are you always using the same analysts? And, do they tend to be middle-aged white men? That is likely the case. So think outside the box. And again, I want to take it further here. If you're calling on a Black person to comment on an issue affecting the Black community, think about how often you're going to the same person and considering that person the spokesperson, the de facto spokesperson for the Black community. I think it's better, honestly, if we use the term communities, because, there are a plurality of voices, opinions within the Black community. It is not a monolith, Anglophones, Francophones, West Indians, Africans. There's all kinds of different groups within the larger Black community, I would say, and they will have different perspectives on different issues. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're calling on people, because, if you just go to the same person all the time because they're available, it's essentially laziness. So I think we need to work on that. And I include myself in that. Look, we're all on tight deadlines. That's a reality. We don't always have time to, dig and find someone brand new when, we have a story that has to get to air in the next couple of hours. But it's just something to think of maybe when you're not under the gun, if you have a little bit of spare time, to, make some calls, develop some contacts, and figure out, okay, who can I call next time? Who's different? Who's new? Who's fresh? Who's original? Let's think about that. Now I want to move into a topic that, yeah, I'm very passionate about this one as well. It's about hair. This is also from the 2016 slideshow. The blonder, the better. Look, these are women I grew up watching. They're legendary American broadcasters: Barbara Walters, Katie Couric, Diane Sawyer. You'll notice that their hairstyles are, relatively similar. I obviously do not have that kind of hair. This slide and this subtitle here, I Am Not My Hair, refers to an India Ari song. And this was a tweet that I posted in 2015. It's been 2 years since my big chop. The natural hair journey continues. So, you know, chopped off my hair and started growing it out in its natural state. And this, you know, hair carries a lot of weight for Black women, particularly Black women who work in the media. There are a lot of expectations surrounding hair. You know, Arissa Cox, just one example, you know, hosted Big Brother Canada. Check this out. She wrote this blog. My boss asked me to straighten my afro, so I quit. So it's not just this HuffPost blog that she wrote. She also wrote a piece in the Toronto Star describing what happened to her. And she recalled going into a manager's office for a routine performance review. And she was stunned when he said, "You've worn your hair straight from time to time. We'd like you to wear it straight on the show." And this is a quote from the Toronto Star piece. "I remember raging to my mother over the phone right afterwards, floored that a middle-aged white dude had the balls to tell me, a modern Black woman in a country as diverse as Canada, how to wear my hair. My stubborn streak exploded. I didn't care about corporate desires for me or my appearance. My hair and all the identity and self-worth and cultural baggage attached to it was not up for debate. I refused to allow my image to be controlled in some boardroom that I was not also in." And now I'm going to take the opportunity to share with you, it's about a 3-minute YouTube video. This was actually prepared by a former Concordia journalism student named Alicia Rubertucci. I'm not sure if she's on the chat, but if you are, hi Alicia. She was actually one of the students in the classroom when I was giving that presentation in 2016, and she reached out to me after for a project that she was working on, a multimedia project for a journalism course. And the theme for her group was hair diversity. So let's take a look at Alicia's work, because she did a great job of summarizing my hair journey.
I actually had my natural hair from the start of my career with CTV. I had been relaxing my hair throughout high school, throughout CEGEP, and in the beginning of university. And it was actually during my university years that I transitioned. So when I started as a summer intern in 2005, I had my naturally textured hair, which I wore in a variety of natural styles, twists, braids. I went on the air, you know, as I was. It was kind of like, take me as I am, you know. Basically, I went through a very bad breakup. I decided that I wanted a completely different hairstyle. I just needed to change. I needed something new and fresh. So I actually cut my hair and started to relax it again with the chemical straighteners. So I had kind of like a Rihanna look where I had like a long bang on one side. Well, one of Rihanna's older looks with a long bang on one side and sort of shaved on the other side and in the back. So it's this asymmetrical look. Had that style for a few years. And then, yeah, there was a point where I just, you know, I got tired of it. And it was proving to be difficult to care for my hair, and I saw that it was being damaged by the chemicals, by the heat, the constant flat ironing, and that's when I decided that I was going to go natural again. So I transitioned back, and I had what they call the big chop in 2013, where, you know, I started to grow out my hair, and once I had about an inch of my natural length, I cut the rest of it off so there were no more sort of straight ends like hanging off. Mothers in particular, and mothers of little girls, you know, because they felt like seeing a Black woman on TV with her hair in its natural state sent a positive message to little girls to know that they could just be accepted, you know, for who they are without having to change to conform to some sort of standard of what real beauty is or what's professional, you know, because there's always the standard that people have been held to, and typically that standard is not, you know, curly afro, you know, that kind of thing. It's about more than, I would say, hair, because hair sometimes, you know, you say it sounds superficial, but it's really about your identity. It's about accepting who you are. It's about accepting the fact that you may have dark skin, or you may have a broader nose or thicker lips. It's just about accepting who you are. I think we just need to love ourselves for who we are, and that's really the message. You know, we need to love ourselves. We need to accept ourselves, and we shouldn't let, you know, traditional beauty standards dictate how we feel about ourselves. You know?
Thank you, Alicia, for that. Alicia, I still get a little bit choked up watching that, because it's so personal and it's so deep, and it really has been a journey. And as I said, you know, it might sound superficial, you know, just talking about hair, but for Black women, it carries so much weight, and it's really tied into, you know, our identity and notions of self-worth. And you know, that's why it's a big issue. And that explains, you know, for example, why Arissa Cox, you know, quit her job over it, because she didn't want someone telling her that her hair had to look a certain way in order to please, you know, a certain in order to cater to a certain expectation of what's an acceptable aesthetic. Now, I also want to talk about mentorship, and we're going to listen to a clip from a podcast called Small Doses with Manda Seals, The Side Effects of Journalism. She speaks to Erin Haynes, and if you don't know her, you should follow her on Twitter. She's amazing. She's a founding editor at large for The 19th, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom covering the intersection of women, politics, and policy. And she's also an MSNBC contributor. She's an award-winning journalist focused on issues of race, gender, and politics. And she was previously the Associated Press's national writer on race and ethnicity. She's worked at the Washington Post, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Los Angeles Times. So let's listen to Ms. Haynes on mentorship.
Well, first of all, do you mentor at this point?
Yes, I do mentor because it's important. And I think, you know, especially for Black women who, you know, maybe are thinking about covering race or thinking about covering politics, right? There are not a lot of Black women, well, Black people, period, in political journalism. Like, most of the political journalists are white men, right? And they tend to reach back for other white men to, you know, come behind them to cover politics. But I mean, we know, you know, the direction that this country is going in, right? Like, that we need Black and brown people actually covering our politics, because that is the direction that our politics is going in. And, you know, for folks who thought that we were kind of in a post-racial era with Barack Obama's election.
You didn't know?
I mean, turns out it's actually hyper-racial. Oh yeah, got that wrong. Anyway, so yeah, but like, it literally takes somebody who is more experienced, who you look up to. It takes for that person to put their hand on your shoulder and say, you can do this. I'm going to help you get there. So like, it is important for me to do that because I'm tired. I'm going to be doing this forever. You know, let's keep it real. So, you know, to be able to say, you know, that I help somebody to get to a place where they, you know, are able to do this work, that is important to me.
So I just thought that was an interesting clip. You know, especially, of course, as a Black woman covering politics, you know, being the Quebec City bureau chief, I mean, I don't often see people who look like me, you know, in the spaces that I'm moving in, you know, at the Parliamentary Press Gallery, you know, at the National Assembly, you know, within political parties, political staffers. It is common for me to be the only Black person in the room. And so what she said about the importance of mentorship, you know, I applaud that, because she's someone who is, you know, in a position where she can mentor up and coming potential journalists, future journalists, and show them, you know, it is possible to make space for yourself in these environments, even if you may not see people who look like you in them. Now let's talk about objectivity. There's been so much talk about that lately. And again, I'm gonna have you listen to some audio clips that I think really highlight some of the issues that we are confronted with right now. I wanna start with this op-ed by Pulitzer-winning reporter Wesley Lowery, who breaks down the myth of objectivity. And if you haven't read this, I highly, highly, highly recommend reading the whole thing. But right now we're gonna listen to some audio clips, because it turns out there's this cool feature on the Times website. And I don't know if this is something that is done with all op-eds or just some of them, to be honest. But for this one, you can listen to the op-eds. So there are a couple of clips that I'd like you to listen to. So let's start with this one. So it's not the actual journalist, Wesley Lowery, reading it, it's somebody else reading it. But I mean, you'll get the picture.
As protesters are taking to the streets of American cities to decry racism and the unabated police killing of Black people across the country, the journalism industry has seemingly reached a breaking point of its own. Black journalists are publicly airing years of accumulated grievances, demanding an overdue reckoning for a profession whose mainstream repeatedly brushes off their concerns. In many newsrooms, writers and editors are now also openly pushing for a paradigm shift in how our outlets define their operations and ideals. While these two battles may seem superficially separate, in reality, the failure of the mainstream press to accurately cover Black communities is intrinsically linked with its failure to employ, retain, and listen to Black people. Since American journalism's pivot many decades ago from an openly partisan press to a model of professed objectivity, the mainstream has allowed what it considers objective truth to be decided almost exclusively by white reporters and their mostly white bosses. And those selective truths have been calibrated to avoid offending the sensibilities of white readers. On opinion pages, the contours of acceptable public debate have largely been determined through the gaze of white editors. The views and inclinations of whiteness are accepted as the objective neutral. When Black and brown reporters and editors challenge those conventions, it's not uncommon for them to be pushed out, reprimanded, or robbed of new opportunities.
Okay, disregard the fact it sounds a bit like a robot reading. Yeah, but in all seriousness, I'm going to continue just by, summarizing a few of the other points that were made in this article before I move on to another audio clip. Lowery writes that, he for years has been among a group of mainstream journalists who've been calling for the industry to abandon the appearance of objectivity as the aspirational journalistic standard, I'm quoting directly here, and for reporters instead to focus on being fair and telling the truth as best as one can based on the given context and available facts. And he goes on to say that objective journalism, he used quotation marks, is constructed atop a pyramid of subjective decision-making. Which stories to cover, how intensely to cover those stories, which sources to seek out and include, which pieces of information are highlighted and which are downplayed. No journalistic process is objective. And no individual journalist is objective because no human being is. So let's get to the next clip.
But it will take moral clarity, which will require both editors and reporters to stop doing things like reflexively hiding behind euphemisms that obfuscate the truth, simply because we've always done it that way. Deference to precedent is a poor excuse for continuing to make decisions that potentially let powerful bad actors off the hook and harm the public we serve. Neutral objectivity trips over itself to find ways to avoid telling the truth. Neutral objectivity insists we use clunky euphemisms like officer-involved shooting. Moral clarity and a faithful adherence to grammar and syntax would demand we use words that most precisely mean the thing we're trying to communicate. The police shot someone.
Let's pick up on that. I'm going to go back to Erin Haynes. We'll hear more from her from the Small Doses podcast. Again, you're going to see, there's certain themes that keep coming up again and again, and this notion of objectivity being something that needs to be called into question, because who determines the rules around what's considered objective? Yeah, I think that's important to look at. So let me find that clip.
I think what you're getting at is a conversation that we're having in our industry right now around the question of objectivity, right? And like what that means. And I have really, I'm not somebody who, even though I was raised in kind of a traditional journalism environment, and that is my foundation, right? Like the idea of objectivity, like I know that is something that originated with white men. And when being white or male is your default setting, objectivity is really easy, to have, or to be something that you say that you have. For me, being fair and being honest and being accurate.
Yes,
that's the point for me, and that is what I think we should be striving for in journalism. All of us have biases. Yeah, all of us have biases. I think that having an awareness of what those biases are, right? Like that can inform the journalism. But acting like they don't exist, that's just not real. And again, like I would just say that like people's lived experiences, like that can bringing that to the journalism can improve the work, especially for Black and Brown journalists in this country. Right? Because I mean, so many of the things that we're talking about right now, and this like national reckoning on race, are things that Black and Brown journalists tried to tell you long before, we had headlines and hashtags, right? But like we were ignored, or we would say, oh, well, should you be covering this because you're Black or you're brown? And it's like, well, hello, like I'm actually somebody who either has experienced this directly or knows somebody who has experienced this directly. So I know these things to be true. Like I can accept this on its face instead of being somebody who is like skeptical of the idea that maybe the police do not treat everybody the same.
So,
okay, and then she picks up on this a little later in the podcast. So we're going to listen to one more clip from this one.
Letting them know when they thought they're being gaslit, especially in the newsroom, right? When somebody is telling them, maybe not to write something, or if they don't want to have phrases like racially charged in their copy, and trying to push back against an editor to say, like, this doesn't really say anything. I want to actually say racist or racism. Like,
because racially charged is like a euphemism for.
Racially charged is me plugging up my cell phone. It doesn't mean anything. Like it really doesn't. And I ask my white colleagues as well. If I see them using that in copy, I will reach out to them. It's not like about me publicly shaming them, but I will pull them aside and say, when you wrote this, what did you mean? And like after a conversation, it's very clear that what they meant to say was racist or racism, but they were not comfortable actually using that term, and so they watered it down.
So I don't know if you caught that, but I like what she said about, you know, racially charged is like me plugging in my iPhone. that one made me laugh. She also was featured in another podcast. It's just a coincidence. So I listened to that podcast and then I listened to a different one. And then she was a guest on that one as well. And she, you know, dives deep into this question about objectivity again. And I want to let you listen to it because she's talking about the protests and the riots in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown in this roundtable, The Media's Reckoning with Racism. So here again is Erin Haynes.
I did see that there were other Black journalists whose objectivity was questioned, as if we suddenly became unprofessional the day that the Black Lives Matter movement began. And if anything, you know, I realized that it was Black journalists who were uniquely qualified to tell the truth of America in that moment. I mean, the premise that police were anything but noble and to be trusted completely was held by many white Americans, including white Americans in newsrooms, because their experience had never been anything to the contrary. You know, meanwhile, that experience was routine for many Black Americans, meaning that Black journalists, someone in their family or their friend circle, were directly impacted by this issue.
So that's an interesting point. And then she explores the idea of, you know, there being two sides to a story, you know, he said, she said, and whether that's truly applicable in all cases.
We really have to ask ourselves some tough questions. Well, what they shouldn't be tough questions, but they feel like tough questions in newsrooms. Do you believe that there are both sides to racism, to misogyny, to misinformation? Because objectivity is what gets you to phrases like racially charged. You understand what I mean? Like we're here to tell the truth. And if we are not going to tell, you know, objectivity, I feel like too often it's cover for people cover for people's discomfort about some of the truths that we have to tell about this country.
Okay, I can see the chat is
I was gonna mention, Maya, there's a few people.
yeah, I see that. Okay, good. I'm taking notes. I just want to let you guys know that I am popping into the chat every once in a while to keep an eye on what people are saying. And I'm also keeping an eye on the time. So it's 2:17. We have until 3 o'clock. And I obviously want to leave time for you guys to ask questions and make comments. So I think we're actually doing well for time. I just have a couple more clips that I'd like you to listen to. Actually, one more clip and then a few more examples that I want to share. And then I'm going to open it up to you guys. So please keep note of what you would like to ask or share, and we're going to get into it. You know, I just want to make a point about my personal experiences with objectivity. I can honestly say that in 15 years working as a journalist and at CTV Montreal newsroom, I've never been questioned about my objectivity when covering a story related to Black people or race issues or racism. I have covered blackface controversies. I've covered controversies over the use of the N-word. I have done features on Black politicians at the National Assembly for Black History Month. I mean, I've covered these stories over and over again. And when I brought a story idea to the table, it has been accepted and welcomed. And of course, it goes through all the usual editorial checks and balances. And that's just, you know, what we do as professionals. But my objectivity has never been questioned. That's not to say that that's not the experience of other journalists, because, you know, as we just heard, it happens to other journalists all the time. My personal experiences with objectivity have been more feeling that I have to stay silent when, for example, people are pushing back on social media and trying to justify things or explain things away. Well, that's not racist, or, you know, that's not really what he meant, or, you know, the tradition is different here. It's not the same. You know, that's an American thing. That's when I have felt that it's difficult to just kind of take all of that and sit back and be silent, because if I say anything, then my objectivity as a Black journalist might be questioned. And I talked about this in my personal essay where I say, and I'm just going to quote directly from it, last fall, I had an email exchange with a fellow Black journalist, so it's about a year ago now. Blackface was the sujet du jour. Twitter was a minefield. We commiserated. I didn't use social media to express my personal opinion on the issue. As journalists, we generally keep our opinions to ourselves and out of our work. It's one of the basic tenets of what we strive for: objective news gathering and reporting. But reading a deluge of hateful, ignorant, and patronizing comments on a public platform and staying silent about it privately takes its toll. I can only bite my tongue lest I be accused of lacking objectivity or professionalism in my coverage of a sensitive race-related issue. It's extremely draining, I wrote. And he responded that he didn't think it should be necessary or encouraged for Black journalists to avoid speaking out. He argued we should be, quote, defending ourselves against bigotry, passive or overt, end quote. And the suggestion that our objectivity was compromised in doing so was yet another way in which Black voices were being systematically suppressed. Now, these are complex issues. Like, there's a separate debate about this in the sense that, you know, I am a journalist, so it is not my role really to be on Twitter talking about how I feel about issues that are making the headlines. Like, that is something that, you know, has pretty much been a standard. And that's why I talk about, you know, some of the basic tenets of journalism, you know, what we're striving for. You know, I'm not going to come on Twitter or Instagram every day and say, you know, I feel this way about this story and I feel that way about another story. Like, that is not what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, there has to be a certain level of detachment. I think we can all agree on that. I think where it gets murky is when you're being subjected to things that are wrong, and you feel like you can't say anything even then. So you know, that's something that's worth discussing. You know, if, for example, someone is lecturing you on Twitter about like the use of the N-word and when it may or may not be acceptable, do you respond or do you ignore it? You know, I've chosen to ignore because that's just the way that I have chosen to go about it. But it takes a toll. It takes a toll. So I want to talk a little bit more about language, and it is 2:23. So this is good because my goal was to, you know, finish this presentation by about 2:30, so we can have at least half an hour for questions, comments, sharing. I talked about language earlier, you know, the choices of the words that we use. And one example that I want to bring up is related to the death of Joyce Echaquan. And, you know, we've all heard the story, a terribly sad, tragic ending for this Indigenous woman at the Joliet Hospital. You know, as I went through the coverage of that, I noted that some news organizations chose specifically to use words like racist and racism, you know, even in headlines or in leads. What jumped out at me about one particular story is that it seemed that reporter was going out of their way not to use the word racist or racism. They talk about, and I'm quoting directly here, derogatory and insulting remarks made to her by a hospital staff member as she lay dying. After the video went viral on Tuesday, Quebec Premier François Legault described the remarks as, and it's quoting, totally unacceptable and, again in quotes, racist, and announced the nurse who made them had been fired. Now this may be a subtle thing or a nuance, but I just found it interesting that the reporter chose not to use the words race or racism. Again, it goes back to like, sometimes people are just uncomfortable calling it what it is. And then attributes the word racist by putting it in quotation marks to the premier. So it's like making a very deliberate choice to, as the writer, detach themselves from using that word and putting it in quotation marks and attributing it to someone else. So in a sense, it's like they've washed their hands of it. That made me uncomfortable for all of the reasons that you've heard before from these other reporters who were talking about objectivity and, you know, bending over backwards sometimes to avoid saying what is true in service of this notion of so-called objectivity. You know, sometimes it just seems, you know, it seems to be absurd, frankly. Why are we trying so hard not to name the thing that it is? And so let me go back to one last clip about that issue of objectivity. This is from another podcast, this one from NPR. It's Been a Minute with Sam Sanders, Reckoning with Race in Journalism. And he's having a conversation with NPR public editor Kelly McBride, who's considered a leading voice on media ethics, you know, really an authority as the chair of the Craig Newmark Center for Ethics and Leadership at the Poynter Institute. So here's their conversation about objectivity. Okay. Bear with me for a second here, just trying to, okay.
Particular biases.
It is refreshing to hear you as a leader in the industry acknowledge that some of this is about the principles and bedrocks of our journalism and some of it's about business. And at the end of the day, for whatever reason, we've ended up with a definition of objectivity that is as much about business as it is about telling the truth. And I think what frustrates so many journalists, so many younger journalists, so many journalists of color or women or queer journalists, is that newsroom leaders are resistant to acknowledge that. I read NPR's social media policy, and it's couched in terms of ethics and morality and ideals of objectivity, but I also know that part of it is the bottom line is I should not do anything as a public-facing person at NPR that would possibly damage NPR's revenue streams. And I'm mad they don't say that.
Yeah, but they don't mean to say that. They don't, I mean, that's the thing, is they really do believe, and I actually believe also that there is a line somewhere that we shouldn't cross. And maybe it is way up the continuum on just, if you're a political reporter, you can't tell people who you're voting for. Maybe the line is all the way over there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because imagine that, like, if you were a political reporter and you were covering Trump's campaign and you were like, yeah, I'm voting for Biden though.
I was that guy. Yeah.
But did you tell people out loud?
I didn't tell folks who I was voting for in 2016, and I wouldn't. But I think those are the ones where I think everyone can agree. But there's other things, like how much of me do I bring to a story when I'm covering police violence against Black men? am I allowed to just say that's racist? Because I know what racism is, because I've experienced it. Trust me, and don't make me say racially tinged or flambéed, you know, like those, and that's where it gets murkier.
Well, you know,
I listen to that so many times, it makes me laugh every time. Don't make me say things like racially tinged or flambe. You know, so again, kind of making light of the situation, but you know, like it is serious. Do we say things like racially charged or racially tinged, or do we say racism or racist? This is an ongoing conversation. I am very curious to see what your thoughts are on that. Again, so in terms of objectivity, and you know, I'm gonna end on that note. I want to bring up another example related to the death of the Indigenous woman Joyce Echaquan at the Joliet Hospital. This was a letter to the editor published in Trois-Rivières newspaper. So you can see here, this was tweeted by media blogger Steve Faggy, and he writes, Trois-Rivières newspaper in the Nouvelliste has unpublished this letter that defends the nurse fired for racist comments against Joyce Echaquan. It has posted a note saying it should not have been published, but does not actually apologize. Now, the letter, you know, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the gist of it is that this person wrote this letter to the editor, and you see, you know, the headline is Deux victimes dans l'histoire d'une patiente autochtone morte dans son lit d'hôpital. So I'm, you know, saying there's two victims in this story. He says the nurse is a victim. L'infirmière en service a elle aussi été victime. And essentially what he's saying is that we don't know the whole story. We don't know what was going on with a patient prior to what we see on the video. We're only seeing a small part of the video. And, you know, nurses, you know, they're dealing with COVID and they are tired, they're exhausted, there's forced overtime. And now this nurse has been fired, and, you know, this is, you know, like this is the treatment she's getting makes her a victim as well. There was a huge backlash to this, so much so that the paper had to remove the letter from its website and all its social media platforms. And I'm just gonna paraphrase, yeah, I'm translating on the fly here, why it decided to do that. It published on Facebook, and it said it was an opinion letter that was inappropriate, and it's decided to retract it or withdraw it from all its platforms. You know, the opinion of a reader concerning the events surrounding the death of Joyce Echaquan. A lot of readers, and you know, with reason, they were right, underline the out of place nature of this opinion piece because of the context, the tragic context surrounding the death of Mrs. Echaquan. And the comments from certain readers, you know, brought us to reflect, and we did, maybe a little too late, but we thought about, you know, the relevance of publishing this kind of opinion letter. And after some thought, we decided to remove it from our website and our mobile applications and our Facebook page. And you read the comments under this, and people are just, you know, they're saying like the damage is done. You know, you really dropped the ball on this one. This was a really shocking thing to read. I hope you've learned your lesson. And it's really sad that readers had to bring this to your attention, you know, be more careful next time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's another example of what happens when, as journalists or as media organizations, we in service of this idea of objectivity, we bend over backwards to make sure there's always two equal sides, or, you know, balance in our coverage. And of course, I mean, don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. Of course, you know, we have to think about presenting different sides of the story and offering different perspectives. And it can't just be, well, one person said this happened and we only consider that person's perspective. But we also have to be careful about, you know, false equivalencies or giving equal weight to opinions or ideas that are damaging and, you know, ultimately do a disservice to our readers or our viewers. And in this case, you know, the newspaper acknowledged that what it published was inappropriate given the circumstances, when you consider that, you know, one woman has died and was subjected to racist comments on her deathbed by the healthcare professionals that were supposed to be ensuring her well-being. And then to say that, you know, the nurse in that case is also a victim, you know, that's something that I think we can all agree is insensitive to the family and those who are mourning the death of the woman. So I think that's something that you guys can, you know, jump in on and share your thoughts about. I think that all of this, you know, goes back to what are we trying to do? What is our role? And we are trying to tell the truth. And there are times when being obsessed with the notion of a particular way of viewing objectivity actually obfuscates the real truth. So we try to be fair, we try to be accurate, we try to provide context, and I think that we just need to be as clear as possible and name things for what they are, even if you know, at times it can be uncomfortable. So I'm going to leave it there, and I am looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say. Don't be shy. I would love to hear from you, see you. You can unmute, you can show yourself on video. Maybe Robin, I'll hand it over to you and you let me know how you want to go from here.
Yeah, well, thank you for that great talk. There's so many comments and questions I see right now in the chat. So what I was going to say is, if you want, you could start looking in the chat, even if you go all the way up, because there was some comments even I think you missed before. Start going in there. But if people want to unmute themselves and we can have a dialogue, that would also be really interactive and fun. But feel free to add more questions, and Maya, I guess she's going to go over the chat and take it from there. But again, feel free to jump in, unmute. Let's have a discussion.
Yeah, so is there anyone who wants to start us off just before I go into the chat? Is there anyone who's ready and willing to ask a question or make a comment?
I do. It's on representation.
Oh, hi, Shakti.
Hi. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much. This was it was super interesting, honestly, and I'm really happy that you brought up so many points that are, you know, extremely interesting and important right now. If I may go back to your section on representation, jump into the objectivity. You know, so I graduated from the program last year, and obviously there weren't many, you know, journalists of color in the program. And so I was wondering if you believe that universities have sort of a responsibility in recruitment of people of color in the journalism department or other, you know, similar departments.
That is a great question. So interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up. Absolutely. You know, everyone has a role to play, and it starts with journalism schools. You know, I graduated from the Concordia journalism department in 2006. And, you know, I was one of few Black students at the time. And I think it is in part because we go back to this original idea of representation. It's like a vicious cycle. If you don't see yourself in certain spheres or, you know, represented in certain areas, you may not feel that you belong there. And so therefore you may not even apply, which is part of the problem. So, you know, specific recruitment measures can be helpful in situations like that, whether in universities or in newsrooms. And I'll make a point of saying that the reason that I am at CTV today is because I was hired as a summer intern under a visible minority internship. It was an internship that was federally funded, specifically to hire a visible minority or racialized person, you know, in the newsroom for the summer and be paid to do work in the newsroom for a 4-month period in an effort to diversify the newsroom. And there's absolutely no shame in that. You know, I never wanted to be considered a token, and I never was. I mean, it was clear to me, look, like we're hiring you, we've chosen you, but you have to do the work, you know? And I just thought, great, like we're on the same page here. I don't want to be a token. I want to do the work. I want to be the best journalist that I can be. I don't want to be here just to meet some diversity quota. And, you know, and I've been there ever since. So I really grew up at CTV. You know, as a 21-year-old intern is how I started. And now I'm the bureau chief. And if I had not had that opportunity, you know, if I had not gotten my foot in the door that way, would I be here? I'm not sure. I think Concordia is fantastic in that teachers really, the professors, they care. I mean, the reason that I knew about that opportunity is because my very first journalism prof, Bob Babinski, you know, was looking out for me. And when he learned about that opportunity, he came to me and said, I think you would be the perfect candidate for this. You should apply. And he put me in touch with the right people. So I was able to do it. So yes, it definitely makes a difference when institutions and the people who work in them care and make a specific effort to, you know, let students from racialized groups know that there is a place for them and they should be encouraged to you know, apply.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to go next. First of all, it's nice to finally meet you. And
Hi.
so yeah, I struggle sometimes when I talk about racial issues, just because I sometimes feel like imposter syndrome somehow. Just because as an immigrant, I can relate to the prejudice that comes from having a darker skin color, but I don't necessarily relate to the trauma that comes from a history of slavery that a lot of Canadians have, and a lot of people in North America have. So I'm not entirely sure how to reconcile not hijacking a movement that's not entirely just about me, right? And so the other part, and I take your point on using the plural term communities, which I think is similar in principle when we say Indigenous peoples, just different experiences. And I'm having a hard time articulating my question. It's just I'm trying to figure out if you have any advice.
No problem. That's okay. I'm trying to sort of take away the nuggets from what you're saying. Are you wondering what you can do to be, you know, an ally? Is that?
Yeah, I guess it's yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I hope that in this presentation, I have given you examples of what you can do. I think the biggest thing is to listen. That's the biggest thing that you can do in order to be an ally, in order to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who are experiencing either racism or prejudice or microaggressions, those kinds of things. Because the reality is sometimes these conversations are difficult and they are uncomfortable. And sometimes when people get called out on their own behaviors or unconscious biases or whatever you want to call it, there's a knee-jerk reaction. You know, people can get defensive. That doesn't help. So I think people need to be listened and to have an open mind and just try to consider that, you know, when we're telling you this is what our lived experience is, you know, just take it for what it is. You know, don't make us have to bend over backwards to try to prove it to you. Like, it's happening, we're living it. So listen to us and don't look for ways to, you know, diminish it. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that you are or anything like that, but I'm just trying to answer the question in a broader way, in case other people are wondering the same thing. I think the biggest thing that we can do is to listen. That's the best way, because when you listen, then there's an opportunity for dialogue, and then maybe you can ask questions and, oh, well, I didn't know that, or that never occurred to me, or it didn't, you know. I'll give you an example. Someone wrote to me after my piece was published and said, you know, thanks for explaining why it can be offensive when people say things like, I don't see color. You know, because this person, a white person, you know, that was their point of view. Like, I don't see color. Like, I don't distinguish between black, white, whatever. And really genuinely thought that they were coming from a good place. And they were. I mean, their heart was in the right place. But what I explained in my piece is that, you know, if you say things like, I don't see color, what you're doing is negating the lived experiences of people who are in this world, in the color of their skin, like as Black people, experiencing things in a different way, specifically because of the color of their skin. So I, you know, as a Black mother, my lived experience is going to be, I am going to have a conversation with my son one day that a white mother won't necessarily have to have with her son. So that's why saying I don't see color is problematic, because you know, it just denies certain realities of differences that are a result of color. So I think, and I was happy that this person took the time to write to me and say, you know, thanks for explaining it that way, because now I get it. Because it meant that this person was actually listening and wasn't getting defensive about it, and was willing to sort of question herself about her own long-held notions of you know, what she thought was the right thing. So just listen.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm gonna take a look at the chat. I don't know if anybody else, Robin, or is there anything that you wanna highlight or?
Yes, so there's supposed to be Camilla has a question, and then Anna, and then Angelica.
Okay, so Camilla,
you want to unmute and ask it?
Yes. Okay. So I just wanted to say that I'm really honored to meet you virtually and that this was really interesting and eye-opening. I'm taking a course this semester about diversity and gender in journalism with Professor Amélie. I think she's in the meeting. So I just wanted to say that it's really, really interesting, and it's really important right now in the times that we're in. So I just wanted to say that. So thank you for doing this. You're really inspiring to me. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So, thank you. So my question is, because before at the beginning of the talk, you were mentioning that words matter, and that is true. So I'm just wondering, because, you know, you were talking about visible minorities and non-white as not being good terms to use, and people of color as well. So I'm just wondering, are there other terms that are acceptable other than racialized people that could work if we're reporting on communities that are not Caucasian in Canada as journalists? That's what I'm wondering.
And that's a really good question. And you know what, I also want to make it clear, you know, I don't have all the answers, and I am not, like, far be it from me to tell you that this is the word that people should be using, or these are the terms. Like, I am not the arbiter of language. I just want to raise these issues so that, you know, they are considered. I think what's important is to, again, it comes back to listening. Listen to what people are telling you about how they want to be identified. I actually, you know, I don't have a problem if someone refers to me as a person of color, but if you want to be more direct, you could just say Black, you know, that's fine. So I think it's really just paying attention to the way language is evolving. I have no issue with being called Black or a person of color. I think the reason why visible minority is considered a dated term is because, you know, minority, it sort of positions that group of people as inferior in a way, just by virtue of the use of the word minority, smaller, less important. So it's those nuances that you have to consider. So a term that's obviously very popular lately, I'm sure you guys have heard it, maybe you've even used it, you know, BIPOC. That's something that I learned about recently. Like, quite frankly, I never heard that before George Floyd. And then all of a sudden I started seeing it everywhere: BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So that's, you know, that's one way around it, if you will. But I think this is an ongoing conversation and discussion to be had. And I think, again, it comes down to listening, to speaking to people in those communities and asking them, well, how would you like to be identified? I think that's one way to go about it. You know, just ask if you're not sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And there was someone else, I think.
Yeah, hi. So I'm a second year journalist at Concordia as well, and I'm also taking that class with Camille there and with Amelie. And so I'm doing my research paper also on hair. So I was very excited to hear that part
Oh,
of
great.
Conference. And I do have a question for you. So I was wondering if you personally, or maybe someone you know, have experienced like any gatekeeping when it comes to like dress codes, either like written dress codes on like appearing on TV, or like non-spoken like rules on like specifically on hair.
So, okay, sorry, can you just repeat the last part of the question? Is the question about hair or clothing? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm focusing on hair, but I meant dress code as in like, well, not dressing, but it's just like appearing on TV.
Are there sort of unwritten rules about that? Okay. So, you know, obviously there's no guidebook that says like, you have to wear your hair this way, but I think there's certain conventions, if you will, or traditionally accepted looks that are considered more acceptable, or have been considered more acceptable historically than others. And a lot of times that's straight hair, you know, like a bob. And like, it's definitely not like a big puffy afro like Arissa Cox has. I mean, I'm trying to think if I've seen someone on a mainstream television network, you know, let's say with an afro, like in recent years, and I can't say that I have. But things are evolving, you know, things are progressing. I am seeing, you know, many more Black women embracing their natural hair, not just on TV news, but in general. And, you know, there are, I think, especially now in this time, as we're going through this reckoning on race, and we're talking about, you know, representation and identity, I think there's much more openness to making sure that we include people who look different and not necessarily expecting them to conform to this traditional European standard of beauty. And by the way, it's not just women, it's men too. I mean, I remember thinking, oh wow, when I saw Tyrone Edwards, who's on eTalk and The Social, has been on The Social with CTV, you know, this big black guy with dreads, and it was like, wow, this is awesome and very refreshing to see. Like, you can have dreadlocks and that's okay. So I'm sorry guys, I'm multitasking here. I just want to Google something really quickly so that I can be informed in my answers. But yeah, to answer your question, there's you know, there's no written rules, but there are things that have sort of just become the traditional norm over time. And I'm glad to see that in the wake of George Floyd, it feels like those things are changing and the change is accelerating. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. I'm sorry, I got a little distracted for a second.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay, that was me next. So hi, Maya. I'm so glad to meet you virtually as well. I just want to say, like, you're such an inspiration. I've been watching you for years.
Oh, thank
Even my
you.
mother, she insisted on me telling you that she's a big fan and she's really happy.
Hi, dear mom.
Yeah, she's saying hi. So I just wanted to know, because I had this conversation with someone earlier last week, and we were talking about representation, whether it's in the media or basically everywhere. And being a journalism student, I'm a second year, I feel like we're lacking representation. And I wanted to know, how do you feel about BIPOC communities? Because sometimes we don't necessarily encourage our children to be a little bit more adventurous or exploring in other fields that is quote unquote not traditional. So I wanted to know, how do you feel about that? I don't know if my question is clear, but
no, I get it. I think, yeah, I mean, I hope I answer your question, but you know, all my life I've been doing things that have been considered, or at least some people might consider them like things that Black people don't do. But I feel like that's ridiculous and arbitrary. You know, growing up, I was very fortunate to have parents who really just taught me that I could do anything that I wanted and anything that I put my mind to. You know, if I pursued an education, you know, they always said education, 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 and worked hard at it. And so there were no limitations. And they also allowed me to try, you know, a variety of different activities, things like, you know, let's say horseback riding or skiing. And I know that this might sound, for some of you, it might sound a bit silly, but there were times where growing up, you were kind of put into a box and it was like, well, Black people don't ski or Black people don't horseback ride. Like, and that's ridiculous. But I mean, to your point about journalism or other professions where you don't necessarily see yourself reflected, again, I think it's like a vicious cycle in that you may not feel like there's space for you there because you don't see yourself there. And that's why representation matters. So I think, you know, parents just have to encourage their children to do what their heart is calling them to do. And it doesn't matter if there are other people like you who are doing it or not. Like, maybe you'll be the first and maybe you'll be a trailblazer. And that is, I think that idea is actually very empowering. And since I was talking about my parents, I just want to give a shout out to them. Hi, Mom and Dad. They couldn't be on on this chat. My mom sent me a message yesterday saying she tried to register and it was sold out. So thank you guys for registering in such large numbers. And sorry, Mom, that you couldn't be on. But as Robin was saying earlier, there's going to be a link available for anyone who missed it and who wants to see it, and that you can share with others. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, okay, bye, Dawn. I see Dawn is signing off. She has a 3 p.m. meeting. For 2:59 on the dot, she had to log off. Thank you for coming, Dawn. I appreciate that. Talking about words mattering, I personally, okay, I'm just gonna read something from the chat here. Talking about words mattering, I personally prefer the term locks to dreads as a way of getting away. Oh, the chat is moving so fast I can't. From the subliminal connotation that there's something dreadful about it. Wow, that is so interesting. Let me read that again in case you guys aren't seeing it on my screen or you didn't hear me as I was kind of reading it to myself. Talking about words mattering, I personally prefer the term locks to dreads as a way of getting away from the subliminal connotation that there is something dreadful about that. You see, I'm learning. That's so interesting to me. I never thought about that before. That's a great point. So see, just listen. And that's something that I hadn't considered. And so I feel that is a great example. That is a great example. Let's see. There was a comment about afros. Oh, that was also from Doreen. Interesting as afros are a bit passé. It's funny, when I use the term afro, I'm not necessarily okay, I'm just gonna reach into my record collection here for a second. This is Leroy Sibbles on this is a Jamaican reggae artist, Leroy Sibbles, on the cover of an album. So he's sporting a little afro here, the traditional, what you might think of when you think of afro. But I think different people see afros in different ways. And when I think afro, I also think of it as just my hair being out, here, Marissa Cox's hair. So it's not I think, it can be defined or looked at differently. So that's just, something that I wanted to mention. Okay, so more comments here. Thank you guys for the wonderful comments that you're leaving. I'm looking at the time, it's 3:02, and so I know some people have to sign off. Robin, I don't know what your limitations are. I'm willing to stay on for an extra few minutes if you can, if you're available, if we have that access. I don't know.
Yeah, well, seeing as how there's so many comments and there's still more at the top, I don't mind, staying for an extra 15 minutes if, people are still here and they're still engaged. So it's fine with me.
Okay.
I saw at the top that there was a lot of questions or comments about when you were talking about, I'm just going back. There was a lot of interesting comments about just trying to find it.
Thank you to TB for this comment. Thank you so much. I like the use of audio. Oh, well, I'm glad. I wanted to make it dynamic, and I had a chance to practice with my sister yesterday. So that's how I got to be able to figure it out. So shout out to my sister Tash for letting me do a dry run with her last night. Okay.
Comment that I saw.
Somebody, Moritz Whitman. Yeah, hi Maya, could I ask a question real quick? Sure, Moritz.
Yeah, hi, that's me.
Oh, hi.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt while you were going through comments.
No, not at all.
Thanks for doing this, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I'm just here to learn and listen.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask one. I'm a graduate student in journalism at the moment. And I'm kind of reading a lot about journalism theory and stuff like that. And I think even on your bookshelf, you have the old Kovach and Rosenstiel.
Oh my gosh, You can actually see it. Yes, yes, here it is.
So that's the classic. But really, my
also, sorry, this one, just sidebar. Also, the politics of Black women's hair. Here's the afro. Okay.
My question is more kind of that journalism has this age old image, I think, of being a room full of white male college educated people telling news. And my question to you is kind of me going forward in the profession. How do I go about telling or covering communities which I don't even think I have the right to tell? You know, I don't even think those are my stories to tell. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. Well, you know what, you're as a journalist, it is your job to tell people's stories, a variety of people's stories from all walks of life. And it is, you know, what you're saying is there's a certain sensitivity behind it, which I like, because you are considering your, you know, the fact that you are part of a privileged group as a white male, and your experience may be different from others. And you want to know that you're able to tell those stories in a way that I guess is you know, respectful of those other communities.
Right.
So yeah, being
aware of my own position and the fact that I feel like those aren't even stories that I have the right to tell. You know what I mean? Like those aren't.
But you do, because that's your job as a journalist. You can tell those stories, and you should be telling those stories. And if anything, you can use your position as a journalist to highlight stories and share people's experiences when they feel they may have been ignored in the past. You know, I've covered all kinds of communities. I mean, I don't only cover stories about Black people, obviously. Right. You know, I've covered you know, issues in, and I'm going to use communities like Muslim communities and Jewish communities, etc. And, you know, again, this is a common thread. I'm going to keep going back to it. I think what's at the heart of being not just a good journalist, but a good, you know, ally is the ability to listen and to consider other people's perspectives. So if you go into a situation or go into a story with, you know, an open mind, I think that makes you a good journalist. And the fact that you're already aware of, you know, the privilege that you have, to me, it's really a step in the right direction. So I think you're doing the right thing, and don't shy away from telling stories, but also look to, you know, make contacts in communities, and, you know, build relationships with people. That's a way to be helpful. You know, get outside of your comfort zone. That will make you a better journalist.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. No problem. So is there anybody else who wants to jump on? Hi.
For me to ask a question real quick.
Yeah, so who's speaking now?
It's Camille.
Oh, hi. Okay, I see you now. I just had to scroll down. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for coming and Thank you for logging on to your computer and talking to us. So I just had a question, because over the whole movement for George Floyd, the Black Lives Movement, a lot of newscasts were outed on Twitter and Instagram for their racial bias and just a lot of the lack of diversity in their newsroom. and they've been exposing like just how they portray news, and the way that they do it is just sketchy. And I personally, this is my last year in the journalism program at Concordia, and I was kind of asking myself, like, do I want to work for a newscast or a news organization that doesn't reflect my values and that are not doing storytelling the way that they should? Like, do I want to have this continuous battle with them? This continuous, like, does that make sense? So I just wanted to know, like, did you ever ask yourself that question prior to working at CTV or anywhere? Did you observe how they, ethically talking, did you observe how they do news, and did you ever ask yourself that question, like, do they fit and do they reflect my own values? Like, do we need, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I have to be honest with you, you know, as Robin said in the introduction, I was only 21 when I entered the CTV Montreal newsroom. So I have to be totally transparent. Like, it wasn't that deep at the time. Like, I wasn't thinking about those things. I was really just, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I didn't know whether I'd end up in TV or if I end up in radio or I'd end up in a newspaper, like broadcast or print. I wasn't sure. I just knew that I wanted to tell stories, and that's all I really cared about. And I jumped at whatever you know, opportunity came my way. And it just so happened that, as I was saying earlier, I got this incredible opportunity to take on a paid summer internship at CTV Montreal. So it was really it's not something that I thought about a lot at the beginning of my career, but I have to tell you, you know, I've been there ever since. And I stayed for a reason, you know, because it is a newsroom that does align with my personal values, and it's very much like a family. CTV Montreal, we are, you know, a lot of my colleagues over the year have become personal friends, you know, people that have come to my wedding, people who've held my baby. Like, that is the kind of newsroom that I work in. It's a privilege to work in it. And so, yeah, I think it is important to question whether the place that you're working in does align with your values. And it's funny that we happen to be on this slide about Arissa Cox, because obviously what was happening in this situation, like, it did not align with her values. She felt like a manager was telling her she had to change her hair, which was very wrapped up in her identity, you know, in order to fit in. And she said, that doesn't work for me. So she left, she quit, and she got another job. And, you know, that, I think that's powerful. So yeah, it is important to feel comfortable in the organization that you're working for.
And I had a follow-up question. So since you've been working in the industry for so long, and especially at the same place, did you notice, like, have you observed changes, and especially in higher position, like, are you seeing concrete changes, or it's still in the making?
Well, we have a new batch of reporters, and, you know, they don't all look the same. And they're not all coming from the same places, and that's great to see. And, you know, CTV is, I mean, look at Mitsumi Takahashi. You know, Japanese, has been with the station for over 30 years and is the face of CTV Montreal, and is one of the most well-respected women in the industry. So I would say that, you know, there's leadership there in the fact that Mitsumi Takahashi was put on the air as an anchor, you know, in the 80s. And she received an honorary degree from Concordia, and which I covered, actually, funny enough, I covered that evening. And she gave a speech, and she was talking about some of her early days in journalism, and you know, working in radio, and a station manager telling her she should consider changing her name to Mary Lee Taylor. Can you imagine? Because Mitsumi Takahashi just sounded too strange. So that is, I mean, obviously she's going to change her name. You know, again, when you are challenged on something that's very close to you, you know, be it your hair, your name, your identity, that can be difficult. Now, I don't want to speak for her, but obviously, you know, in sharing that story, when she gave the speech at the convocation, you know, it revealed that this was something that stuck with her, you know, from the beginning of her career. So, you know, all that to say, I think that our newsroom is, it's a space where there are a diversity of faces and voices and opinions, and I feel lucky to work there.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so the chat. So Judy, oh, no worries, Judy. You're not the only one. That's happened before, MIA instead of MAYA. No problem. She just mentioned that she spelled my name incorrectly earlier on. No worries. So thank you everyone for all these comments. Camila, I'm just seeing some comments that have been sent to me privately that I haven't been able to respond to, but I can assure you, like everyone who sent me a private message, I'm gonna respond to you. Robin,
I'll jump out of the shadows, Maya. Hi. I was lurking in the background just to say thank you. That was a great presentation. I have the privilege of working with Maya. My name is Jed, and just want to thank Concordia and you for such a well-prepared and thoughtful presentation and great initiative. So congratulations.
thanks, Jed. Oh, I appreciate that. Jumping out of the shadows.
Yeah, can't get away from the camera quick enough.
That's my boss.
Been there, done that.
Is there anything else? I'm still looking at the chat. Robin, was there anything that you saw that I didn't quite catch?
Well, I know earlier a lot of people were talking about when you were mentioning about how a lot of companies and brands were making an effort, what was happening this year, to have more diversity and Black faces and Black voices. And some people were commenting if this was sincere inclusion or if it was just kind of to fill a quota and actually just appear more diverse. And I know a lot of people on social media have been discussing this. If what had happened this year hadn't happened, would companies have been doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think it's kind of suspect, if you will, that all of a sudden all of these companies seem to be just like jumping on a bandwagon. So is it sincere? I mean, I'm going to use an old journalism cliche. Don't ever use this in your stories, time will tell. But really, in all seriousness, I think we're only going to know over the long term if this is a continued and sincere effort, or if it's just, you know, the flavor of the week or the flavor of the moment or whatever that expression is. So I think that over time, we're going to see if this is genuine or if people are just doing this, you know, like as a corporate face-saving measure. But it's kind of, you know, I've discussed this with my sister, for example. It feels a little frustrating. Like on the one hand, you're torn, right? Because part of you is, oh, this is great to see, you know, this is great to see this change happening. But it's also frustrating because it's like, we've been here all along. Like, why did it take a George Floyd for things to change so drastically, so quickly? Like, I would say what we've seen in the past few months is something that would have taken years to achieve, maybe in other circumstances. A generation to achieve. I mean, I don't know. There's no way of knowing for sure. But there's that cliche again. Time will tell. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the comments. What time is it? 3:19. Okay, so I think we're gonna have to wrap this up soon, but if there's maybe one or two more comments, I'm just going quickly into the chat.
Now is your last chance for questions, everyone.
Yeah, last chance.
I think you have a question in the yeah.
Alexa, have you experienced gaslighting or tokenism in the newsroom? So this is something that I addressed earlier in the presentation, and no, because I have always sensed a genuine openness to my questions and my concerns about certain stories. And whenever I've brought stories to the table, about racism or race-related issues, they haven't been questioned. And conversely, I've never been, forced to cover Black stories or been pigeonholed, because that's another issue. Like you can fall into that too. Like it could be, oh, we have this Black reporter, so let's have her do all the Black stories. And like, I never wanted that. I like to do so-called Black stories or stories about Black communities, and I pitch them routinely. But I never wanted to be the Black reporter who's only doing the Black stories. So that's one thing. But my experience is not everyone's experience, okay? And, I want to, actually, this is something that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but this is an opportunity to do it now, just quickly. There's a story that I read called, this was in the Walrus. Objectivity is a privilege afforded to white journalists. And it's by a Canadian writer, Pacinth Matar. And, I recommend that you read this article, so you can Google it. Objectivity is a privilege afforded to white journalists. And she describes being sent to Baltimore to cover the aftermath of the arrest of Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray died and under circumstances, in the back of, there was a violent arrest. He ended up in a coma after he was in the back of a Baltimore police van, and he later died. And she talks in this piece about how she was talking to, Black men in like the midst of everything that was happening on the streets. And they were describing incidents such as, being called the N-word by various officers and unwarranted police searches. Police will grab you, make you pull your pants down, things like that. And one of the men that she interviewed said, I think that people will think we're making this stuff up. And she said that when she brought the story back to her newsroom, the executive producer didn't want to air the interview with them because they said, how can you verify that these men gave you their real names? And she was really taken aback by that. Like, why is this being questioned? Why are you questioning? Like, are they real? Are their stories real? Are they true? So I suppose that is an experience of, a Canadian journalist feeling that she was gaslit in a newsroom. I encourage you to read the piece for yourselves. Again, it's called Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists in the Walrus. So yeah, it hasn't been my experience personally, but it does happen. Hi, Dario. Okay, I am going to respond later to some of these comments. So yeah, I think we're gonna have to wrap this up, but I am going to be in touch with Robin. I can, I'm on social media, I'm on Twitter, you can DM me if you have other questions or comments, and I will try my best to get back to you in a timely manner, or maybe it won't be timely because I have a 10-month-old, so I'll get to it when I can, to be honest. but yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and, you know, taking the time. This has been, you know, really great for me as well. I miss this, you know. And I say that because when you're at home with a baby, you don't always get to engage in conversations at this level, put it that way. So this has been refreshing and really nice, and I look forward to, you know, doing it again sometime down the road. And you know, Robin, I can always, like, if you get comments or emails from people who want to connect or ask more questions about resources or sources or some of the articles or podcasts, like I'm happy to share. You know, I can, you know, maybe put together sort of a list of a lot of the sources and the things that I referred to and share that, and, you know, then people can listen, you know, to the full podcast or read the full articles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.